Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. We are tackling something today that honestly has probably kept a lot of us up at night. Like how do we write code that doesn't make us want to pull our hair out months or even years down the road?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what we're looking at today? We're going to be diving deep into building code that lasts over at CodeSkill Chronicles. Really interesting stuff in there.
Yeah, I was really impressed. And you know what's really cool about it is like whether you're a total beginner or you've been coding since, I don't know, dawn of time, there's some really solid advice in there.
Yeah, it really just boils down to, I guess, recognizing that those core principles of, good maintainable code, those apply to everyone, right? Doesn't matter if you're just starting out or if you're super experienced.
Totally. And one of the things they talk about right off the bat is foundations. And I love that analogy
Mm-hmm.
because, you think about it like you wouldn't build a house without a solid foundation.
Yeah, of course not.
So why on earth would we do that with our code?
Exactly. And that's where in code, that foundation really comes down to clarity and structure, right?
Yeah.
Think of it as your architectural blueprint.
Okay.
And if you don't establish those clear naming conventions right from the start, things can get messy fast.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure we've all seen those variables like, dataStuff or something like that, where
Yes.
6 months later, you're like, what on earth is this thing?
Oh, totally. And then you spend like the next 3 hours trying to figure out like what it all means and untangling that mess.
Exactly,
Uh,
exactly. And that's where, clear naming conventions really come in. Instead of, data stuff, it's customer order data, product inventory list, something that actually tells you what it
it's like
is.
speaking English, right? Versus like some weird code language that only you understand.
Exactly, exactly. And along with that clear naming, you've got to sprinkle in comments too, right? And I don't mean like paragraphs of text, just concise explanations of your intent, just enough to guide someone through your logic. Think of it as leaving breadcrumbs for your future self or for your fellow developers.
Gotcha. So it's kind of like that combination of making the code itself readable and
Yeah,
then adding those little notes to be like, hey, this is why I did it this way.
exactly. It's all about making that code self-documenting as much as possible. But Code Skill Chronicles goes a step further than that and talks about planning, right? Like
Yeah.
even before you write a single line of code.
Oh.
Have you ever just, dived straight into a project without thinking about the structure first?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Yep.
Especially if I'm like really excited about the project. I'm just like, let's go.
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah, I get that, but trust me, like even just a quick sketch on a napkin can make a huge difference, right?
okay.
It helps you visualize that overall structure. You can break down complex tasks into smaller, more manageable chunks. You avoid creating those massive, unwieldy functions that are just a nightmare to debug later.
Okay.
It's like having a roadmap before you embark on a long journey. It makes things so much smoother.
Yeah. That makes total sense. So you're saying like spending a little time up front can actually save you like tons of time and headaches later on.
Absolutely. And speaking of avoiding future headaches, CodeSkill Chronicles is really big on adaptability. They had this great line where they said, the only constant in tech is change, right?
So true. It seems like every time I learn something new, something else pops up. And it's like, all right, time to learn that too.
And that's exactly why building adaptable code is so crucial. It's all about anticipating those future needs,
Yeah.
even if you don't know exactly what those needs will be. And one classic pitfall is, hard coding values directly into your code.
Oh, yeah, like that example they gave about the API endpoint
Oh, yeah.
that was hard-coded. And then they're like, oh, well, the server moved. And it's
Yeah.
just like chaos.
Yeah, total chaos. And that's why using config files is such a lifesaver. You're storing those values externally so you can easily change them without having to, dig through your code base and risk breaking things.
So it's kind of like separating the content from the presentation. You've got like the structure of your code, and then those config files allow you to easily like swap out the details without messing with the core logic.
That's a great analogy. And while we're talking about avoiding unnecessary complexity, the good old DRY principle comes into play. Don't repeat yourself. It seems simple enough, but you'd be surprised how often code duplication creeps in.
Yeah, sometimes it's just so tempting to copy and paste,
Oh, yeah, it's so easy to do.
instead of taking the time to create a function or something.
Totally. And it might seem like a time saver in the moment, but it can lead to major headaches down the road. If you need to make a change, you have to update it in multiple places. It increases the risk of introducing errors.
Right.
So by following DRY, reusing that code effectively, you reduce that redundancy, you make your code base much cleaner and easier to maintain.
It's almost like you're creating like building blocks that you can use again and again.
Yeah.
So we've got strong foundations with clear naming and planning. We've got adaptability through config files and avoiding repetition. What about keeping this code healthy in the long run? I'm guessing that's where the maintenance part comes in.
You got it. CodeSkill Chronicles. They're big on testing,
Yeah.
even for seemingly small functions, and they have a really compelling story about why that matters so much.
Oh, right. They talked about like a little typo that brought down a whole e-commerce site's checkout.
Oh, it's a scary story, but it shows why automated testing is so valuable. It's like your safety net, catching those subtle errors that might otherwise slip through the cracks.
Yeah, it's like that last line of defense.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And they said with the e-commerce site, their automated tests caught that error before it hit production,
Oh, wow.
saved them from a potentially disastrous situation.
That's amazing. So those tests are basically like little vigilant guardians making sure everything is working as it should.
Exactly. And what about CI/CD pipelines? They mentioned those too.
Yeah, CI/CD, I'm not super familiar with how that all works, but I know that they mentioned it.
Yeah, CI/CD pipelines, they might not be the most glamorous part of coding,
Okay.
but they're absolutely essential for ensuring that code quality and catching those errors early on.
So can you like break that down for me a little bit?
Sure. So CI stands for continuous integration, and CD stands for continuous delivery or continuous deployment.
Okay.
Essentially, it's a set of practices that automate the process of building, testing, and deploying code changes.
So instead of manually like running those tests and pushing code updates,
Yeah.
you have this automated system that does it for you.
Exactly, exactly. With CI/CD, every time you make a code change, it automatically triggers that series of tests.
Oh, wow.
And if those tests pass, the code can be deployed to a staging environment or even directly to production, depending on your setup.
Wow.
So it helps to catch errors early on. It makes the whole development process much more efficient.
That sounds amazing, especially for like larger teams where things can get really complicated really fast.
Yeah, absolutely. And to make that whole system work smoothly, though, there's one more crucial element that CodeSkill Chronicles really drives home.
Okay, what's that?
Documentation.
Documentation. The thing that none of us want to do, but we all know we should.
I know, I know. It can feel like a chore,
Yeah.
but it is absolutely essential.
It's like cleaning your room.
Mm-hmm.
Like you don't want to do it, but it makes life so much easier.
Exactly. And even just a simple readme file explaining how things work, that can save countless hours of frustration for anyone who needs to understand your code later, including yourself.
Yeah.
Remember that anecdote they shared about inheriting a system with zero documentation?
Oh, yeah. Sounds like a nightmare.
It was like something out of a horror movie. Good documentation is a gift to your future self and to anyone else who might work with your code.
Right.
It's about empathy, right? Making sure that your code remains understandable and usable over time.
Okay, so to recap this first part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
it sounds like we've got strong foundations with clear naming and planning, adaptability through config files and avoiding repetition, and a focus on maintaining code health through testing and documentation. Phew, that's a lot.
It is. And all of this contributes to building that code that stands the test of time.
Right.
Which, if you think about it, it's really about building a legacy. When you think about the code that we write every day, it's not just a bunch of instructions for a machine. It's a reflection of us, our thought process, our problem-solving skills. And, really it's about that commitment to creating something that lasts.
Wow, you're totally right. It's like when you put it that way, it's kind of like, whoa, nobody wants to be remembered for writing code that's just like a nightmare to work with.
Exactly, exactly. It's about taking pride in your work, right? Creating something you can look back on and be like, yeah, I did that and feel good about it.
Yeah.
And when you approach coding with that mindset, you naturally start to focus on those things like maintainability and readability. It's about making life easier for that next person who has to interact with your code, whether that's a colleague or, some future developer or even yourself 6 months down the line.
Yeah, totally. It's like the golden rule of coding.
Yeah.
Write code for others the way you'd want others to write code for you.
Precisely. And speaking of making life easier for future developers, there's this point from CodeSkill Chronicles that really stood out to me. It was this idea of leaving notes for your future self.
Yeah.
I think we've all been there, right? We revisit a piece of code that we wrote ages ago and we're just like, what in the world was I thinking?
Oh, yeah, totally. It's like staring at a foreign language. You're like,
Yeah.
I recognize these words, but I have no idea what they mean.
Exactly. And that's one of the biggest frustrations with dealing with legacy code, right? But by leaving those clear and concise comments, we can help our future selves and other developers really understand why we made the decisions that we did.
Right. So it's kind of like leaving a message in a bottle.
It is. It's like sending a message through time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's more than just like explaining what the code does, but like the context,
Hmm.
the rationale, like all of this stuff that might not be obvious just by reading it.
Exactly. So for example, let's say you're working on a function that calculates shipping costs, right? You might leave a comment explaining why you chose to use a particular shipping API or how you handle those edge cases like international shipments.
Gotcha.
Those little nuggets of information can save someone hours of digging through documentation or trying to reverse engineer your logic,
Yeah,
right?
it's like leaving that trail of breadcrumbs.
That's a great analogy. And they shared this interesting story in CodeSkill Chronicles about a time they were working on a project with a particularly complex algorithm.
Okay.
And instead of just leaving a comment explaining the steps involved, they actually included a link to a blog post where they had written this whole detailed explanation of the algorithm and how it worked.
Oh, that's smart. That's like next level documentation.
Mhm. It is. You're not just limited to those comments within the code.
Right.
You can use those external resources to provide even more context and clarity.
Yeah, I love that.
And it's all about using whatever tools are available to make your code as understandable as possible.
Awesome. So we've talked about the importance of building strong foundations, designing for adaptability, embracing a maintenance mindset, and communicating clearly through both code and documentation. As we're kind of wrapping up this deep dive, I'm wondering, is there anything else we can do to sort of improve the overall quality of our code and really avoid creating those legacy code nightmares?
That's a great question. And, it brings us to one of the most powerful tools that we have as developers. Collaboration.
Yeah.
CodeSkill Chronicles actually encourages their listeners to, share their experiences, both good and bad, with the wider coding community.
Oh, I love that. It's like this collective wisdom of like what works and what doesn't.
Exactly. By sharing those stories, our successes, our failures, we can all learn from each other's mistakes and avoid repeating those same pitfalls, right?
Yeah, it's like having this network of mentors
Hmm.
who's already been there and done that and can be like, hey, watch out for this.
Exactly. It's almost like an open source approach to coding knowledge.
Totally.
We can all contribute to building a better coding feature by just sharing our insights and experiences.
I love that.
And, sharing doesn't have to be this formal process, right? It can be as simple as, having a conversation with a colleague about a challenging coding problem that you faced, or,
Right.
writing a blog post about a new technique that you learned.
Yeah,
So it's all about fostering that culture of continuous learning and improvement.
totally.
The more we share, the more we all benefit. And ultimately, that's what building code that lasts is all about, right? Is recognizing that we're not just writing code for machines, we're writing code for other human beings who will have to interact with our work, whether that's today, tomorrow, or 10 years from now.
Yeah, that's such a powerful way to put it. It
Mhm.
really makes you think about like the impact that our code has on other people.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about like getting the job done.
Right.
It's about creating something that is well crafted, that's understandable,
Okay.
and that's maintainable, right?
Exactly.
It's about leaving that positive legacy behind.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Hmm.
So, as we wrap up this part of our discussion, remember, building code that lasts is a journey, not a destination.
Okay.
It's an ongoing process of learning, adapting, collaborating, and it all starts with that simple shift in perspective.
So instead of thinking about code as just like a means to an end, we need to start thinking about it as like a craft.
Yes.
As something that deserves our care and attention.
Exactly. And you know what? That's what leads to code that we can be proud of. Code that stands the test of time, code that makes the world a slightly better place, one line at a time.
And speaking of making the world a better place, CodeSkill Chronicles had this one final point that I think kind of perfectly encapsulates this whole idea of writing sustainable code.
Mhm.
It's about thinking beyond the code itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they're challenging us to think about like the bigger picture.
Yeah.
How does the code we're writing today actually affect people who are going to use it tomorrow or even like years down the road?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, It's so easy to get caught up in the technical weeds.
Yeah.
But we have to remember that at the end of the day, we're creating things that impact people's lives, right? I mean,
Yeah.
whether it's an app that helps people connect or a website that provides access to, essential services or a system that streamlines some, complex process, our code has the power to make a real difference in the world.
It's true. It's like we are almost like digital architects, right? Shaping the way that people interact with technology and with each other.
Hmm.
And, if we're not careful, our code can create like barriers instead of bridges.
Exactly. And, think about accessibility, for example. If
Yeah.
we don't design our code with accessibility in mind, we're potentially excluding a whole segment of the population from being able to use our products and services
Right.
or consider security. If our code is riddled with vulnerabilities, we're putting people's personal information at risk.
Oh, it's a really scary thought. So it's not just about, like you said, getting caught up in the technical stuff. It's
Mhm.
also about like ethical responsibility.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to think beyond just that immediate task at hand and think about, the long-term implications of our work, right?
Yeah.
It's about asking ourselves those tough questions like, who will use this code? How will they use it? What are the potential risks here? And how can I, mitigate those risks? It's almost like we need to develop like a code conscience.
Yeah, I love that.
A code conscience.
It's like this set of principles that guide our decisions and
Mhm.
help us to write code that's not only functional, but also ethical and sustainable.
A code conscience. That's
Yeah.
a great way to put it. And you know what? It's not something that's set in stone. It's something that evolves over time, you know,
Yeah.
as we learn and grow as developers.
Right. And that's where I think that idea of sharing our experiences comes in again,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like by talking to other developers, reading articles, you going to conferences, that all helps us to kind of broaden our perspectives.
Absolutely. It's like this continuous feedback loop.
Yeah.
We learn from others, we apply what we've learned to our own work, and then we share our experiences to help others.
Right.
It's a collective effort to really raise the bar for code quality and those ethical considerations.
This has been such a good deep dive.
Yeah.
It's really made me think about all the different things that go into writing good code.
Mhm.
It's so much more than I initially thought. It's not just about like, following best practices or using the latest framework.
Right.
It's about taking this holistic approach, like you were saying, and considering the technical aspects, the human aspects, and the ethical dimensions.
I couldn't agree more. And you know what? The beauty of it is that anyone can embrace these principles.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you're just starting out or you're a seasoned pro, you can always strive to write code that is not only functional, but also maintainable, adaptable, and ethically sound.
So to kind of sum up our deep dive into building code that lasts, we've learned that it's all about strong foundations, adaptability, a maintenance mindset, clear communication, and I think probably most importantly, like you said, that commitment to building code that reflects our values.
Yeah.
And that makes a positive impact on the world.
Well said. And to all of you listening out there, we really encourage you to, take these principles to heart.
Yeah.
Think about the code that you're writing today. How can you make it more robust, more adaptable, more ethically sound? What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind?
And remember, you don't have to do it alone. There's a huge community of developers out there who are passionate about this stuff. So connect with them, share your experiences, and let's work together to create a future where code is not only functional, but also a force for good.
That's what it's all about.
Until next time on The Deep Dive.